The first crunch of gravel under Evan Cole's hiking boots was like an exhale. After months of working 60-hour weeks at the auto shop and living in a haze of caffeine and cheap takeout, he was finally out in the wild. He parked his truck at a narrow trailhead deep in the Bitterroot Mountains, tossed a weatherproof bag over his shoulder, and tightened the straps. His breath formed small clouds in the cold morning air. The forest greeted him with silence, heavy and still. The plan was a solo hike, 36 hours through remote ridgelines and valleys, no cell phone coverage, just him and nature. He wasn't the fittest guy out there, but he had trained for weeks. This was his rite of passage, a hard reset. 3 hours in, the trees grew thicker and the trail steeper. Wind whistled through skeletal branches. Snow still clung in shady patches from the last storm, making parts of the trail slick. He paused often, letting his heart rate settle, watching pine needles spiral down from above like ash. There was beauty here, sure, but also an edge, a wildness that felt indifferent to him. He reached the overlook by early afternoon. A jagged escarpment dropped off before him, revealing a valley slashed by a winding river far below. Evan took a long drink of water and ate half a protein bar, noting the sun had started its descent. He should be close to the cabin marked on his map, a century-old ranger post, now abandoned, but still offering shelter. It sat near the river bend. That was his destination before nightfall. He descended the switchbacks, steady and careful. The terrain changed. Rocks gave way to damp soil and moss-covered logs. The air was cooler here, and the sounds were different. Frogs, water rushing, a bird's shriek overhead. As the trail ended in a wide clearing, Evan saw it. Just ahead, the river. He froze. It was not the tame, lazy stream he had imagined from the topo maps. It was wide, fast, angry, gnashing and foaming over slick boulders. The path stopped at its edge, and there was no bridge in sight. The nearest way around would take hours. Evan looked up. The sun hovered low. If he didn't cross now, he'd be setting up camp in the open, exposed. He didn't like that idea. The air was dropping quick, and he had heard something moving in the trees during his descent, something that didn't sound like a squirrel. He took off his boots and socks, tied them around his neck, and stepped into the water. It was like stepping into ice. The first few feet were manageable. The riverbed was rocky, the current fast but not overwhelming. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself forward. At about waist depth, he paused, trembling, and looked ahead. He was maybe a third of the way across. He stepped forward again, and the riverbed vanished. A drop-off. He plunged. The water slammed into his chest, sucked him under, spun him like a coin. He clawed toward the surface, gasping, his breath ripped from his lungs. The cold was 1,000 needles. Rocks scraped his legs, his arm cracked hard against something unseen, and for a moment he thought he heard himself scream, but it was just bubbles rushing past his ears. Then he was up again, coughing, limbs flailing. The current dragged him downstream. He saw sky, then trees spinning, then nothing, and then a shape. Something massive, dark, with antlers like branches reaching out of a dream. Watching him from the opposite bank. Just watching. Evan came to on the riverbank, face down in mud and pine needles, lungs spasming as he coughed up what felt like a gallon of freezing water. His arms trembled as he pushed himself up, every muscle screaming, his skin scraped raw and white with cold. His backpack was gone. His boots gone. One sock still clung to his neck like a drowned worm. He had no idea how far he'd been dragged downstream. Blinking against the sharp burn of water in his eyes, he looked around. The woods were darker now, the sky a bruised purple behind spindly trees. He felt utterly alone, until he turned his head and froze. The elk stood no more than 20 feet away. Its body was enormous, far larger than any bull elk Evan had ever seen in videos or nature documentaries. Towering maybe 6 or 7 feet at the shoulder, with an ancient, gnarled rack of antlers thick with moss and lichen. It didn't move, just stared. Evan's breath hitched. Despite its size, the animal gave off no threat. No pawing the ground, no snorts, no bluff charge. Just silence. "Hey!" Evan whispered hoarsely. Get out of here." The elk tilted its head slightly, as if trying to understand. Evan staggered to his feet and winced. His ankle throbbed, badly twisted if not broken. He tried a step and fell hard, groaning. The wind cut through his soaked clothes like knives. Hypothermia. He knew the signs. He had maybe an hour before he'd stop shivering. He needed shelter. The elk stepped forward. Evan tensed, ready to shout or throw something, but the animal only walked a few feet, stopped, and looked back at him. Then again, another few feet. It paused, waiting. What the hell? Evan blinked. He was alone. No backup. No map. No signal. Either he froze out here, or— "Fine," he muttered. "Lead the way." He followed, limping hard, pain shooting up his leg with every uneven step. The elk moved slow, like it understood he couldn't keep up. It weaved through trees, always staying just far enough ahead to urge him on. Evan's body was shutting down, his hands numb, his thoughts sluggish. He kept repeating, "Don't fall asleep. Don't stop moving. Just follow the elk." After what felt like forever, they crested a small hill. The trees thinned, revealing a sunken hollow choked with brush, and in the middle, a half-collapsed trapper's hut. It was a miracle, or a hallucination. Evan didn't care. He stumbled through the brush and practically fell through the warped wooden door. The inside stank of mold and old animal droppings, but it was dry. He peeled off his wet clothes, teeth clattering, and wrapped himself in a mildew-covered tarp hanging from a beam. He shivered uncontrollably, curling in on himself like a dying animal. Through the narrow crack in the wood, he could just make out the silhouette of the elk, still standing watch outside. A moment later, it turned and disappeared into the trees. The night passed in fragments, Evan half-conscious, shivering in the dark, dreaming of river water in his lungs and massive, inhuman eyes watching him from the trees. At one point, he thought he heard voices outside, whispering low, in a language that didn't sound real. But when he pressed his ear to the crack in the wall, there was only wind. And hoof prints. Deep ones, circling the cabin like something had walked around it. Many times. By morning, the storm had come. Snow, thick and relentless, blanketed the ground, erasing everything. Evan awoke aching, half-frozen, his lips split, his limbs stiff with cold. But he was alive. Barely. His memory of the elk felt dreamlike now. Ridiculous, even. He forced himself up and hobbled to the door. There, in the clearing beyond the cabin, stood the elk. Waiting. Evan limped out of the ruined cabin, legs like brittle sticks, breath steaming in front of him. Snowflakes spun sideways in the wind, soft but insistent. The elk stood just beyond the clearing, half shrouded by pines, unmoving. It shouldn't still be here. Wild animals didn't wait around for people, especially not overnight. He knew that. Everything about this, its size, its presence, its strange patience, set off something primal in his gut. But even stranger was how, despite all logic, It made him feel safe. "Are you real?" he croaked, his throat raw from thirst and cold. The elk turned its head slightly, then walked into the trees. It didn't run, didn't vanish. Just walked, deliberate, glancing back like it had done the night before. Evan hesitated, then followed. He had no other direction. His internal compass was scrambled, his phone waterlogged, and his ankle still throbbed. The only thing guiding him now was something he didn't understand. The elk led him slowly through the woods. Snow muted everything. No birdsong, no rustling brush, only the wind and his own uneven footsteps. Occasionally he'd stop to catch his breath or hold a tree for support, and the elk would pause ahead, waiting. Then he began noticing strange things. A torn piece of faded fabric fluttering from a low branch. A sleeve, maybe. A boot half buried in the snow, crusted with moss. Broken twigs in a too clear line. Signs that others had passed this way. Not recently. Maybe not safely. He didn't say anything. Just followed. Hours passed. His vision swam, and once he fell and lay in the snow for nearly 5 minutes before forcing himself back up. The elk had waited silently the entire time, watching from atop a slight ridge. When the snow began to ease, the light dimmed to an eerie grey-blue. Evan blinked hard, thinking maybe it was dusk again, but the sky had a strange, leaden quality. Off. As if time here bent slightly. As if this path was outside the rules of the forest he knew. Eventually, the elk stopped at a clearing. Evan's breath caught. There, lying in the snow, was a small black pack. His pack. The one that had ripped off in the river. He limped forward, stunned, and picked it up with trembling hands. Everything was soaked and half frozen, but his emergency flares and protein bars were still intact. So was the metal whistle attached to the strap. He looked up, but the elk was gone. Gone. No hoof prints. No sign of movement. Just the wind picking up again, colder now. Evan sank to his knees. The wind howled. He was alone again. Then, a crack of a branch behind him. He whipped around. Nothing. Just trees. Then to the left, a low sound, like breathing. Heavy breathing. Not his. "Hello." His voice cracked. He scanned the trees. Movement. Something tall. Another elk. No. It moved wrong. Too slow, too upright. "Is someone there?" he whispered. Then he saw it. At the edge of the clearing, half obscured by shadow, something stood just between the trees. Man-shaped, but too tall and too narrow. Its limbs seemed to flicker slightly at the edges, like heat waves rising off pavement. Its head was antlered, but not like the elk's. These were jagged, twisted like broken tree limbs, and far too wide. It didn't move. Evan stumbled backward, dropping the pack. His pulse thundered in his ears. Then a low sound filled the clearing, like a groan made of wind and bone. Not a word, not quite. Just pressure, presence. He backed away. Slowly, carefully. The figure didn't follow. But it didn't disappear either. As he crept away through the trees, he swore he heard something behind him. A second set of hooves. Evan didn't remember much of the next hour. Just movement, pain, cold, a rising panic in his chest that clawed at his thoughts, refusing to let him rest. He kept limping forward, one eye always on the trees behind him, where something else now walked. Whatever it was, it never got closer, but it never fell behind either. He tried to call out once, just to say something human into the silence, but his voice was barely a whisper. And even if someone had been nearby, who would believe him? That he'd nearly drowned and was saved by an elk that somehow led him into a dreamlike stretch of forest where something wrong was following him? The terrain began to dip. Trees thinned. And then, suddenly, he heard it. The river. Evan's heart lurched. The current was still fast, still roaring, but thinner now, forked into smaller channels from runoff and snowmelt. It looked survivable. On the opposite bank, maybe 30 yards ahead, he saw something bright. A jacket. Orange. A hiking group. He limped faster, wading into the shallows, boots soaked through again, ice crawling up his legs. He was halfway across when he heard it. A hoof strike on rock. Not behind him, to the side. He turned, and the elk was there again. It stood on a narrow outcrop just downstream, still regal, watching him with eyes that seemed older than the forest itself. Wind pulled through its thick coat. The river foam lapped at its hooves. Evan's voice broke. "You! What are you?" The elk didn't move. But something else did. The trees behind it, bent, like something massive brushed through. That same tall shape flickered between trunks. Still watching. Still following. Evan staggered forward, pushing through the last stretch of current, muscles locking up from cold. Every step felt like it might be his last. And then he was across. 2 hikers turned at the sound of splashing. "Oh my God, hey!" one of them shouted. A man in a red beanie broke into a run. "Are you okay? Dude, are you hurt?" Evan collapsed just past the waterline, gasping. He tried to speak, to warn them, to thank something, but the words didn't form. Just sobs and water and ice. The hikers pulled him up, wrapped him in a poncho, radioed for help. One gave him water. The other patted his back, eyes wide. "You're lucky, man," the second said. "You're really lucky. Nobody comes out of that section. You must have gone off trail or something. We were about to turn back when we saw your outline in the water." Evan shivered violently. "Did you see it?" he managed. "See what?" "The elk," he whispered. The man frowned. "No. You were alone." They guided him up the hill, back toward the trailhead. As they crested the incline, Evan couldn't help but look back. Across the river, in the shadows, the elk stood at the tree line, watching. Behind it, just for a second, the tall, narrow shape stood again, part man, part tree, part something else. Evan blinked, and both were gone. He spent the next 2 nights in a hospital in Missoula. Mild hypothermia, cracked ribs, sprained ankle, scrapes, dehydration, exhaustion, but alive. When the ranger came to get his report, Evan told him the truth, at least most of it, about misjudging the river, nearly drowning, about finding shelter, about the elk. Not the shape, not the breathing, not the voices in the trees. The ranger smiled kindly and nodded. "You know, we used to hear stories like that. Decades back. Old forest tales. Elk showing up when someone's lost or dying. Always figured it was just frostbite dreams. Brain trying to comfort you while you fade." Evan looked down at his hands, still bandaged. "Yeah," he said. "Maybe it was." But part of him didn't believe that. A month later, back home, Evan developed a habit of staring out his window at night, watching the edge of the tree line beyond the apartment complex parking lot. Listening. Just in case. One night, after a hard rain, he stepped out to get air. Wind stirred the branches. A dog barked a block over. And from the trees, so faint he might have imagined it, came a low sound. A hoof. Striking pavement.